Good afternoon to everybody from Catalonia. Good morning to the US, and welcome to the online debate on the future of multilateralism. Let me start by thanking the delegation of the government of Catalonia to the US and its head of office, Isidre Sala, for their support in organizing this debate. This is the first event of the DIPLOCAT Digital Talk Series 2021 that will focus on new challenges, usual problems, the world seen from a decentralizing perspective. At DIPLOCAT, we tend to describe our mission as building bridges between Catalonia and the rest of the world. And through these bridges, we facilitate the exchange of people, ideas, and projects. We do it with tools such as international debates like this one. And our aim is, above all, to share knowledge and exchange good practices among international actors on the strategies to follow in the immediate future, as well as to participate in the international sphere and contribute to the major global debates. An immediate future not only monopolized by the COVID-19 pandemic and the social and economic crisis related to it, also by other pressing issues, which are not new at all in the international agenda, such as keeping international peace and security, protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, migration, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, just to mention some of them. Most of these issues can hardly be ruled by nation states on their own. Since 1945, multilateralism has tried to give answers to our global challenges. However, during Trump's administration, it suffered a huge setback. Even though now President Biden has shown his intention to bring stability back to international organizations, academics have long signaled and analyzed two major problems that the multilateral order must face. First, the fact that the US continues to mark an international agenda despite losing power to China. And second, the loss of relevance and legitimacy of international organizations. Today, we will discuss about the current situation of multilateralism and its prospects for the future. We will also try to foresee which principles should be reinforced to deliver a more inclusive and sustainable multilateral system, and which reform of the multilateral organizations is needed to make them fit for purpose. We will also try to tackle the role of the US, China, Russia, the EU, and other regional organizations, and explore which role, if any, is left for new emerging actors, including non-state and sub-state actors, civil society, and corporations. This talk comes in a very timely moment with a recent joint communication from the European Commission and the High Representative on strengthening the EU's contribution to rules-based multilateralism, just published last week, which defines more clearly what the EU wants for and from the multilateral system and sets out how the EU can achieve what it wants. No doubt the expectations are high. We will see whether we can draw any conclusions from this debate. And now I would like to give the floor to Miquel Royo, who will moderate the debate. Mr. Royo is the Director General for Global Affairs of the Catalan Government. Previously, he worked as Deputy Delegate of the Delegation of the Government of Catalonia to the European Union. He holds a degree in International Relations from the University of Birmingham and a master's degree in European Studies from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Miquel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. Good afternoon from here in Barcelona, and thank you for joining us to discuss the future of multilateralism, which, as Laura was just saying, it's quite a big subject to tackle in an hour and a half, but we're going to do our best and try to get to the bottom of this. We often hear of a shared opinion that the current multilateral system has been in a crisis for some time now. And we have often acknowledged that this crisis exists, and we have seen that problems such as the climate crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, which is now a go-to global problem, but it affects our day-to-day actions, and other problems that Laura was saying before. The only way to solve it, some believe, is that we quickly act to ensure that an effective multilateral system can help us overcome the urgent challenges these problems pose. But despite some ineffective efforts here or there to try to reform this multilateral system for the past few years, it seems that perhaps now we're at a final crossroad where those involved have to decide if it's in their interest to collectively fix or save this multilateral system. That is, if those involved in it want it to be saved. Take the UN, for example, which marked its 75th anniversary last year. It is aware of its problems. It is open to reform. But what kind of reform? Who will lead it? Reform it with what purpose? How can non-state actors have their voices heard within the system? Perhaps today we won't be able to answer these questions, but maybe we can answer the following. What is the cost of a world without a United Nations? Or what is the cost of losing all multilateral arenas? These are some of the questions that we have, but obviously we want your participation as well. So feel free to pose your questions and comments through the YouTube chat, and we will, at the end of discussion, share it with our panelists so that they can reply to your questions. You can also use the hashtag multilateralism to get in touch with us. To discuss this and other issues today, we have three panelists joining us. First of all, Dr. Pol Bargués, who is a research fellow at CIDOB Barcelona. His work focuses on debates on international intervention, peace building, and resilience. He has examined the evolution of the EU's external action and is specialized in the post-conflict governance process of Bosnia and Kosovo. Among others, he is author of the book Deferring Peace in International State Building, Difference, Resilience, and Critique, and co-author of Mapping and Politics in a Digital Age. He is also the co-editor of the Journal of Intervention and State Building and the Routledge Studies in Intervention and State Building. Welcome, Paul. Second is Mr. Vassilis Ntousas, who is the Senior International Relations Policy Advisor at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies in Brussels, and an Academy Associate at Chatham House in London. His research interests lie in European foreign policy and the EU's global engagement. Previously, he held the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Academy Fellowship at Chatham House, where his research focused on the role of the EU in renewing the multilateral system. From 2015 to 2019, he led the International Research and Reactivity Program at FEPS, covering the world's major regions. He is also the author of several policy papers and regularly comments on global affairs for international media outlets. Welcome, Vassilis, and thank you for joining us today. Last, we have with us Dr. Maria Àngels Oliva i Armengol, who has been working at the International Monetary Fund since 2005. She's Deputy Division Chief at the Technical Assistance Strategy Division of the Monetary Capital Markets Department at the IMF. In her 16 years at the IMF, she has worked, among others, in many program countries, including Greece during the crisis, Iraq, Maldives, Pakistan, and Egypt, to name but a few. Maria Àngels joined the fund from the European Central Bank, where she focused on G20 relations in Asia. She also worked on the competitiveness of the World Economic Forum and in academia in Paris. She co-authored a textbook on international trade and co-edited the book Regional Economic Integration in a Global Framework. Welcome, Maria Àngels, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. The way we're going to structure this today, we're going to have three questions at the beginning, so looking at the past, the present, and more the future. And we'd like your take on these questions, and perhaps later we can move on to discussion and answering the questions from the public. So first of all, looking a bit on the past, we'd like to focus on the decision taken by the Trump administration to leave the Paris Agreement or to defund international organizations such as the UN, which deepened the crisis of multilateralism. All this happened while at the same time, international organizations suffered a series of crises. Some say a crisis of power due to the shift of geopolitical leadership towards China, a crisis of relevance due to obsolete structures unable to react to global challenges, and a crisis of legitimacy brought by rising nationalism worldwide. So taking this into account, perhaps one question that we can start asking is, to what point can we reform the current multilateral system and ensure it reflects changes that we are seeing globally? Are there any specific issues that must be changed for the reform to work effectively? It's quite a question to unpack. So first, I'll give the floor to Vassilis. Perhaps you can give us your opinion on this question. The floor is yours.
Many thanks. Moltes gracias per la invitación, and many thanks to the organizers for including me in this very interesting discussion. Indeed, a lot to unpack in that question. I guess the simple question is that yes, the system is in dire need of reform. But this everyone knows in a way. But what is perhaps not easily accessible to the average person when they engage in this quite convoluted discussion of multilateralism in crisis is the depth and the breadth of the current crisis. Because even in the past, Laura mentioned that the multilateral system since 1945 has attempted to bring about peace, stability, and so on and so forth. But of course, the multilateral story is much longer, because there is the story of the League of Nations, which is not a happy story for the longevity or the sustainability of multilateral efforts to bring about some sort of sanity in the international domain. So I think the system is clear that if it can only survive if it transforms. It's also clear that not responding to the enormous urgency, the need, the pressure for adaptation, there is a huge risk that the multilateral system, the fabric of multilateralism, if you'd like, would really come apart as it seems. And of course, the paradox is that we're risking having the situation brought on us, especially when we need the multilateral system the most, because of the very nature of the global challenges we're facing. But I think before starting to sort of reflect on what is needed to overcome the current crisis, I think we need to be more specific about what the crisis is all about. Because I think there are a lot of buzzwords that are being circled around. There's a lot of talk about the crisis of multilateralism and a generic understanding of what this pertains to. But I think we need to be specific. You were right in saying that there is a legitimacy problem. But when we offer this sort of accusation of legitimacy, we often equate it to demands in the developing world, and that's not correct. The legitimacy issue, I think it's very interesting and indeed necessary to sort of note that it implies an output, but also an input problem. Concerning the output, we can say that if the multilateral system was designed to enable states to achieve outcomes that they could not reach by themselves, it's clear that if the system works, it does not work for everyone. And regarding the input aspect, there are several multilateral processes, institutions, arrangements that have been rightfully criticized for lacking transparency, for denying equitable chances of representation to specific actors, because they are reflective of the power dynamics of a long time ago. And many of these systems, many of these processes are rate poorly when it comes to accountability. Now, for a long time, this has been prevalent amongst developing countries, emerging powers, China, India, Brazil, but others as well, which have felt that there is an asymmetric distribution of power that favors their more economically advanced counterparts. But it's crucial to note about in the diagnostical parts that this is no longer a case only there. The permissive consensus around multilateralism has also been shattered or at least shaken in many developed economies as well. And what happened in Europe regarding TTIP or CETA, or in the US regarding NAFTA is very much indicative of that. The second aspect that I think we need to bring into the discussion is that of the machinery. Many multilateral structures have often been left to rely on a set of mechanics and machinery that is definitely not fit for purpose for the 21st century. And we can talk about many facets of that, such as the non-involvement or the limited involvement of non-state actors. But this has only accentuated this perception that the system is antiquated, is inconsistent with its times. And of course, lack of progress in one policy area when it comes to upgrading the system or an insufficient response in that policy area has inflicted reputational damage to the entire structure of the system. And finally, as you said, there is the rise in global power competition. Usually we hear about this, but we need to be much more specific when it comes to describing that facet of the crisis. We need to be absolutely clear that the current crisis is made much more severe by the fact that the challenge to the system used to originate mostly in known antagonists, known opponents to the system's fundamentals. But especially in the last few years, this challenge has come from former champions of the system. And of course, the US under President Trump is or does encapsulate this dynamic in the clearest manner. But even there, we need to be much more specific. Trump did not create all these issues. The aversion or the lack of consistent commitment of Washington towards multilateralism is not due to Trump, only due to Trump, because Washington's commitment to multilateralism has rarely been straightforward. But what Trump did, because of his personal aversion to multilateralism, because of his strong preference for bilateral transactional policies, has accelerated the pace of the crisis, has enlarged the scope of Washington's disengagement from multilateralism, and because of his personal idiosyncratic nature, he has shown intent to wreak havoc to the same system, to the same global order that the US has led and defended for the past few decades. And of course, then we had the COVID crisis, which really showed us how uncooperative the global order has become. It has also fast-tracked Washington's disengagement in multilateralism. It has heightened Washington's strategic competition with Beijing, but it has also widened the normative differences among states over what is considered an appropriate response to the crisis. So where do we find ourselves right now? We find ourselves in a moment of acute crisis. And the only silver lining that I find is the fact that the crisis, because of COVID, has really illustrated in a visceral fashion what is at stake if multilateralism declines further. There is a risk that everything becomes paralyzed, everything becomes politicized, and so on and so forth. So for the EU, as well as for the multilateral system's other remaining proponents, this is very damning evidence that the system must change if it is to survive, that tweaking is not sufficient. Comprehensive renewal, comprehensive reform is necessary. And that's where the pessimism comes, because everyone agrees that reform is necessary, but there is genuinely no shared idea as to the way forward. Sometimes when I think of this, I'm reminded of the meme that says that everyone likes change, but nobody wants to change. And I will end on this note. Change, reform, renewal implies compromise, implies facing up to difficult dilemmas, hard choices. And this is something that I'm not genuinely convinced that all major powers, and in a way, most of all the EU, which prides itself as being the best defender of the multilateral system, I'm not genuinely convinced that actors like the EU can really face up to these hard choices. And we can discuss about what that means in practice, but let me give you an end on that, a final example. If we are to have WTO reform of the World Trade Organization, and this is something that the EU genuinely wants, what does this mean in terms of policy compromises or institutional questions of representation, such as voting rights? And these are issues that are bound to arise if the push behind the reform agenda is to be believed as genuine. So we need to be accurate about the diagnosis, and we need to be very clear about what is needed and the difficulty of the road ahead. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm trying to restart my video, but I don't think it's working right now. There we go. Thank you very much. I think we'll get back to the EU slightly later, but I want to, you talked about machinery not fit for purpose, antiquated, that needs comprehensive reform, comprehensive renewal. I don't know, Paul, looking at the United Nations, do you think this is possible, that we can get this comprehensive review and renewal? Where would we start? Can we get this kind of compromises in the near future?
Hi, Miquel. Thanks for the invitation, first of all, and for the question. The short answer to the question of whether the UN will reform is no. I think it's interesting to see the UN, because it is indicative of the moment in international relations. 3 months ago, the UN was celebrating its 75th anniversary. In the beginning of the year, it thought that it would be a great celebration. In the end, it was in the middle of a pandemic that has caused a global drama. In the celebration, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, emphasized that we are in a moment of necessity. States cannot solve pandemic on their own. They must cooperate, and therefore the UN must stand and be active. Cooperation is essential, and yet the context is not favorable. The UN today lacks legitimacy because there is great power competition and because there is a lack of leadership in international relations. Let's look at the bigger picture. Let's look at the past, as you suggested in the beginning, because the UN had 2 great moments during its 75 years of existence. After the Second World War, when it was created, institutions were proliferating, the Global Health Organization, the World Bank, etc. New members were joining. And the second moment of success for the UN was the 1990s, where after the Cold War, advances were made on gender issues, peace building, or climate change. For instance, the Kyoto Protocol to reduce the emissions of gases with greenhouse effects was agreed upon and ratified in the 1990s. In both moments, 1945 and 1990s, there was a consensus on 2 basic things. There was leadership and there was little contestation. The winners of the wars were the leaders of the world, and there was little opposition to this. The Allies won the Second World War, and the US and Europe emerged as winners of the Cold War. There were losers who complied, like Germany, Japan, and then after the Cold War, Russia. So after the Second World War, the leaders pushed the UN to have a great ambition to rebuild a fractured world with devastated economies and societies. After the Cold War, the winners and leaders pushed the UN to democratize the world. Unfortunately, today the world is very different. There is no consensus on who is the winner, who is winning. We are in a multipolar world where the US has withdrawn from leadership and there is a great power competition. When we see that there is no certainty, we always claim that there is huge uncertainty. It is because there is no vision that can impose itself. For an organization like the UN that builds on consensus, it is difficult to articulate decision or act decisively in any crisis. The consensus today is that, as the Secretary General Antonio Guterres put it in the commemoration, there is an urgent need to reimagine multilateralism, to face the crisis that cannot be solved if states act on their own. But of course, with great power competition and contestation, this reform that is needed is not going to happen. The compromise and commitment that Vassilis was talking about is not possible if there is no winners or losers in today's international relations.
Thank you, Paul. And let me now give the floor to Maria Angels. And I think we've heard 2 perspectives, but I think Maria Angels also helps us, peek behind the window, because we've talked a bit about what we see from the outside, what we think can happen, but you live it. You actually see the real consequences of this cooperation or lack of cooperation, or compromise or lack of compromise. So I don't know. I give the floor to you so you can put your insider perspective, let's say, on this issue. Oh, I think you're on mute, if I'm not wrong. There you go.
Yes, sorry about that. No, thank you so much. I was saying that it's really a great opportunity and great honor to join this panelist and be part of this debate. Yes, I live multilateralism every day in my work, basically. And for the last 16 years, I've been working at the International Monetary Fund. And what I would like to bring here is more of the economist perspective from the ground. And when we talk about the need to reform the current multilateral system, in a nutshell, my answer would be rather no. We really do have a framework that remains very valid as of today. That doesn't mean that it doesn't need to continue evolving to respond to realities. In July 1944, in New Hampshire, USA, 43 countries met and agreed to create the Bretton Woods institutions, namely the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Trade Organization, which later became really a reality much, much later with the World Trade Organization back in January 1995. It already showed the difficulties of consensus. But let me a little bit more elaborate on my answer and focus on 3 pillars, which to me are critical. One is the values. Are they still valid? Our mandates and our work agendas. In terms of values, this multilateral framework back already in 44 was grounded on 2 pillars: consensual decision-making and cooperation. And that's the words that we keep talking about, is we need to get into consensus, we need to continue cooperating. Our institutions are governed by the board of directors and of governors. And this board represents, as of today, for the IMF, 190 countries. The latest member has been Andorra, joined the IMF last October 2020. The World Bank represents 189 member countries. And the WTO has been also increasing their membership over time to 164. So the level of representation is pretty broad. And even the WTO now, with its 164 members, represents 98% of the world trade. The World Bank, it's focused mostly on developmental issues in building infrastructure and coping with the structural issues. The IMF is focused in its mandate on financial stability issues. And the WTO is focusing on the rules governing trade. All 3 are very broad and complex mandates that are very much alive. We are all concerned about growth, jobs, financial stability, and making cooperation work at the trade level and also on the financial sector level, right? We're not living in the same world that we live in 1944. We are now in an interconnected world where technology plays a significant role and borders kind of diluted, right? We're not anymore in this world of manufacturing and agriculture where the central bank is looking inwards into the economy. We're looking into central banks that are often facing institutions, financial institutions that operate across borders. But still, the mandate is the same, is to ensure financial stability in their economies. And this is valid for each of the economies in our membership. They are all concerned about making sure that they can provide enough liquidity into the system, that they have enough funds to pay for their bills, and that the neighboring countries or their major trading partners are also following responsible policies so that they don't inflict damage on others, right? They don't create these negative externalities, but positive externalities to them. So yes, the multilateral framework is, in my mind, is still very valid, but it's reforming. It's not written on stone, but it's evolving, and we see it with the membership, and we see it also as a result of economic change. We see it in 2020, 2010 with our reform on the voting powers. Right now, after Madame Lagarde approved the 2010 reform plans already in 2016, and it wasn't an easy endeavor and continues to be task to be completed. But we managed to have 4 emerging countries that are among the 10 countries with higher voting powers at the IMF. Just to also mention, in terms of our work program, we have a core set of issues that we are all concerned about, as I was mentioning, supervision and regulatory issues in the financial sector are very much at the core. Also, debt management practices. We also have monetary and FX, foreign exchange policies that we need to continue monitoring. But we also have new topics that are emerging, like fintech, cybersecurity, climate change, gender equality, and that those are very much in our future plans or current plans, basically. And we're building capacity in those areas where 30 years ago we didn't even consider them as part of the main challenges ahead, right? So just to complete, to finalize, just to say that, no, I don't think there is a need to change the system, but to improve it, to adjust, to make it more agile and adapt to the new realities that we are confronted to. So yes, leadership and strong institutions were necessary in 1944 and continue to be very critical in 2021, and especially with the recovery that post-COVID that we are being confronted with. So I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't go away, because I'm going to go back to you very soon as we now we've talked about the past, but we now want to talk a bit about the present. And when we talk about the present, we want to juxtapose President Trump's administration and President Biden's administration that has now confirmed that the US is committed to the multilateral system as a way to face global challenges. At the same time, however, despite these global challenges, which obviously with the pandemic are more present than ever, we are also seeing conflicts of old, such as war, which some would say are local conflicts, but have global connotations and cause global problems as well. Perhaps the situation of having the usual problems plus the new global challenges, it brings this multilateral system to its limit. So the questions of how we govern this multilateral system are at the forefront. So when we look at how it's governed and the power that these states have, what are the major normative gaps today related to the global governance system and its role? So when we look at policy domains, does it make sense for global rules and institutions to constrain national actions if they can be constrained? And perhaps when we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that in some places, different actors, regardless of, that are not state actors, have played a better role in facing these global problems, be it multilateral system or being other non-state actors. So will states keep refusing to cede any kind of sovereignty to face these issues, to find solutions to these issues? Will we be able to find solutions through international and multilateral organizations? Maria, I want to go back to you first, because you had a more positive outlook on multilateral organizations and multilateralism. So I want the positive outlook first, hopefully.
Okay. Well, these are really very complex questions, and there is no right and wrong answer to these. What I think we need to put together is I'd like to put some thoughts around it. And I truly believe that we have a very well-defined multilateral framework. It's my humble opinion that it's not about more, it's about making sure that the current framework works well, that they have the right tools to deliver on their assigned mandates. I don't see the need to expand for it. In my mind, more doesn't mean better at all. It is more about ensuring implementation, adherence to the spirit of the rules agreed, and buy-in by the vast majority. And this is where I think sometimes things fail. We work with national entities, local governments, and that's where the challenges are, right? Is to be able for them to follow through on commitments. And that's where we have to do the challenge and where we have to help. So we do have many international agencies that have been proliferating, and we have the health international institutions, we have labor, communications, tourism. We also have a number of international standards in place to ensure best practice. For example, in the financial sector, we have the Basel core principles, we have insurance core principles, securities core principles. So the challenge is how countries actually make sure that they can apply them, include them in their DNA, and do the best out of it. Because it's not just for their own benefit, but also for the international community as such, right? So just to elaborate on 3 points, perhaps 3 thoughts. One, it comes from the spirit of Coase theorem in economic theory. Negotiations are needed to reach a mutually beneficial outcome in the presence of externalities. We are all facing externalities coming from our open borders, basically. And I'm talking about broadly speaking. We have FDI right now is talking about $860 billion around before COVID. We're talking about $19 trillion in trade flows. Everybody's exposed to it, right? So the way to internalize the cause of it, and we've seen it also with the design of COVID vaccines, with the Paris Club Agreement, in order to internalize climate change, and WTO is a perfect example. But perhaps in the European context, the EU bond market is another extremely useful or good example of it, of this effort. So we all recognize that there are benefits out of it, but we also have to recognize that in these negotiations and in reaching these collaborative agreements or common standard practices yield incentives for come together with incentives for free riding, for first mover gains. And that's where the efforts have to come, and is to have a strong international community that discourages them, that really ensures enforceability to the spirit of the text, not just checking boxes exercises, which is, in my mind, the challenge that we have, that the incentives for free riding or first mover gains are really important. They are not discouraged very often, that often. The second point that I would like to mention in this context is ensuring bottom-up approaches, and is the parts built into the unit, in my view. And this is really important because there are basic principles, as I was mentioning, this in the financial sector, the BCPs, the Basel core principle, that they help us move in the same right direction. But we must also recognize that no size fits all. We know that local governments have a better understanding of the realities on the ground, that the federal government faces asymmetrical information vis-a-vis local governments. The mayors understand what the citizens need better than governors, but governors also see the big picture. So they need each other. And the question to me boils down that do we want real harmonization with fewer differences, or do we want to preserve diversity and differences as an integral part of our society? And in my mind, growth requires diversity. So my final point would be that the core issues are still the answer, are still very much at the core of the answer. And that the current pandemic is likely to pose difficult, challenging questions where we will all need to collaborate and be effective as possible if we want to recover our standards of living pre-COVID as soon as possible. Issues such as having a robust institutional framework in our domestic institutions, a healthy banking sector, sound insurance sectors, availability of monetary instruments and collateral, proper debt management practices, sound fiscal management. To me, those are really at the core of what the work that we are doing. So the answer to the question is we do have, we work in a globalized world, but differences are a part of it. We need to recognize them and make sure that this make the totality stronger. I will leave it here, perhaps.
Thank you, Maria Angels. I'm going to now go to Vassilis, because we're talking about checking boxes and the spirit. So I don't know if you want to take it from there and looking at the pandemic and everything we talked in the previous question, if perhaps the member states will be just checking the boxes for the new future, or now is the moment to actually focus more on the spirit of the intentions of what they want to do in order to reform it, for it to work better.
Thanks, Miguel. Speaking of ticking boxes and whether it becomes such an exercise, I think I'm going to start with a more general comment, which is, and listening to Maria Angels, this came out strongly because she was talking about a particular slice of the multilateral system. I guess it's worth noting that there is no such thing as the multilateral system. If we are to unpack the concept, we can see that there is no such thing as a monolithic structure that has the same reach, that has the same composition everywhere. So when assessing what needs to be done, whether it's going to become a much more inventive, creative process or a box-ticking exercise, when assessing where there are normative gaps that we need to fill in and work towards this direction, I think we need to be mindful that the system as currently structured is very uneven. There are areas where institutionalization is quite thick. Maria Angels referred to the IMF, the World Bank, trade, the WTO is another area. These are areas where processes, arrangements are intricate, sometimes too complex, but that these are processes that go a long way back, and therefore there is an established predictability in how we see certain actors using or abusing the system. And this creates the demand for fatigue, this creates the reality of fatigue, the demand for reform. These are domains where reform means upgrade. It means gradual expansion. It means evolution. It means building on, if you'd like. And then I'm afraid I will sound pessimistic again by saying, because the reform angle contains risks, implies compromises, relies on meeting halfway, I'm not quite sure that bigger players that have long established interests, vested interest in the system as currently functioning, are ready for this change. The thinking is that we might gain a better functioning system, but this might mean that we need to enjoy a less privileged position. And are we ready to do this? So this is the problem when it comes to these thicker, more institutionalized areas. But there is a whole other reality. There are entire policy domains, from migration to cyberspace, or space for that matter, that have been either incompletely covered or not covered at all by multilateral governance. And therefore, in those cases, the sources of contested legitimacy that Pol referred to are very different. The actors are much more diverse. because the rules of the road are far less clear. And Mariangel's referred to cyber, for example. If we look at cyber, there are tremendous normative gaps there. And there's also a tremendous first mover advantage, but there are tremendous normative gaps there because the multilateral, the international community has launched many overlapping formal and informal initiatives, but overall the multilateral fabric remains very thin. So the issue in those areas is that we have global problems, instability in cyberspace, for example, but there is not a sufficiently protective global governance system. So the demand of renewal or reform or change there is very different. And I should add, in many of these cases, I'm not quite sure whether proper intergovernmental multilateralism is the answer. The ultimate objective, for example, when it comes to cyber, is not the creation of a WTO equivalent, an intergovernmental forum where states come in, negotiate, and so on and so forth. The ultimate objective there should be a cyberspace that we see it as a field where norms are discussed, advanced on the basis of multi-stakeholder governance model that does not solely concern states. So, and I should add that this entire exercise, speaking about the EU, becomes all the more intricate because the EU's own engagement with these various areas is very different. There's trade, where the EU has exclusive competence, and where, as I usually state, the EU does not only speak with one voice, but rather with one mouth. And then all the way to the cyber, where the EU proper doesn't have this level of coherence, where it's mostly about member states driving the discussion forward. So to answer your question, there can be no straightforward answer. There are other areas that demand very different solutions to others. There's other areas that it shouldn't be only states engaging in order to tick boxes or come up with something more inventive. But I think, and this is my end point and my plea, I guess, regardless of the policy area, I think the multilateral system, or this sort of system of collectively coming together to respond to crises and problems, is suffering not only from normative gaps, but also from a mindset gap. Sometimes I think the solution is for all of us to realize that we need to change our mindset. And Pascal Lamy has put it very aptly in an article a couple of years ago, where he said that the mechanisms underpinning multilateralism in the 21st century will be less like cathedrals built in stone, but rather flexible as tents. So in many fields, and the efforts towards greater stability in cyberspace is a very good example of that, the real work of not just ticking boxes, but coming up with this more creative attitude that is needed, setting more ambitious standards, setting more positive practices that can induce positive behavior by all actors involved, requires a different framework than in the past. So it's also about changing mindset that has been long and deeply embedded. And that's where my pessimism comes from. It's not just about changing power politics, it's also about changing a long and deeply embedded and established mindset. And that adds an extra layer of difficulty.
Thank you. You mentioned, talking about this mindset and the question that you say, are these actors ready for change? Paul, as I said at the beginning, Trump was very clear in his ideas. The Biden administration said the complete opposite. Is it just words? Are they ready for change? And is it just words, but they will continue acting, not necessarily at the president level, but at all the other levels, the same way they've been acting all this time?
It's very interesting to talk about Trump and its comparison to Biden, because we usually tend to see them as opposite, but I would like to think of them that they are not that different, especially if we look at the wider picture and look at the last 4 US presidents and the international context in which they governed. We see then how Trump is closer to Obama than we think, and closer to Biden, with differences, of course. But I would like to do this exercise. First, the America of Bill Clinton, 93, 2001, in the context of the end of the Cold War, there was enthusiasm in democracy promotion. It was a moment of expansion and euphoria for the US and the liberal democratic ideas that they were putting forward. Bill Clinton, for example, intervened through NATO to end the war in Kosovo, or to build peace in the Balkans. Second, a few years later, George Bush began his mandate and had to intervene in 2 major wars, against the Taliban in Afghanistan and against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Like Clinton, it was about expansion of democracy. Unlike Clinton, however, Bush foreign policy was also linked to the security of the US after the 9/11. And he pursued all economic gains and all other interests. At the end of the decade, all these wars and interventions of democratization and expansion of liberal principles were seen as imperialistic, neo-colonial. They were seen as morally wrong and economically costly. And then American foreign policy changed. Obama arrived with the promise of ending the war in Iraq and retreating the troops from Afghanistan. He also closed Guantanamo. Obama represented the end of a foreign policy of expansion and intervention abroad, at least as we recognized it in the 1990s and early 2000s. This was not Obama's choice. It was out of necessity because of all the critiques against the neo-colonial interventionism that Clinton and Bush, but also because it was very expensive to intervene abroad, and because the mandate of Obama occurred in the middle of the financial crisis, which extended in the US for a couple of years or 3, but in Europe last until 2013, 2014. Also, Obama, unlike Clinton or Bush, was dealing with an increasingly contested world, where the BRICS, Russia, China, and others were on the rise. So Trump, in a sense, continues this tendency of less international engagement. Like Obama, he withdrew troops from Afghanistan and from Syria. But, and this is a big but, of course, he brought this tendency of retreating from the international arena to the limit. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. He withdrew from Iran nuclear deal, from Human Rights Council, from the World Health Organization. Also, unlike Obama, and here is where we put the focus, he polarized international relations. He was controversial, for instance, when claiming that the coronavirus was a virus from China, when denying climate change, etc. He acted as if China and Russia could only be strategic competitors or rivals, even enemies, rather than sometimes competitors, sometimes partners. He did a trade war with China. He picked sides in Venezuela. He declared an end to the peace talks with the Taliban in Afghanistan, etc., etc. Biden is trying to rebuild all these alliances and partnerships broken by Trump. For instance, one of the first acts in office was to sign up the US to COVAX, the initiative to distribute vaccines to all states. So he's trying to rebuild, to connect what Trump had broken. But the point I would like to make here, and to end this question, is that Biden cannot expand democracy abroad or become like Clinton and do a moral crusade and become the police of the world and change and transform other societies. He will be much more cautious about it, and of course try to build the alliances and the networks that Trump demolished, especially in the last 2 years of his mandate.
Thank you very much. Let me move now to the third and final segment of questions, which focuses on the future. And actually, we've actually touched on this a couple of times during the different panelist discussion, but I want to focus on one hand on the possible innovative ways that new actors can be engaged and the principles can be applied and in multilateralism, and how the EU, how its role will change or what its role will be in the immediate future. Can subnational actors also play a role in this framework, especially taking account, as we were talking before, the EU is made up of state actors, subnational actors, supranational actors. Taking into account the states have usually blocked multilateralism to protect their own interests, should non-state actors, such as sub-state actors, civil society, corporations, should they use market and social mechanisms to catalyze collective action? What role is left for these actors in this future of multilateralism? Paul, perhaps you can take this question first, as you were the last one talking. How do you see this?
There's a lot of questions there about the EU and about the non-state actors. Let me start with an example of the EU. I attended a webinar 2 months ago, and the EU was celebrating the 10th anniversary of the External Action Service, and it put together in this webinar Javier Solana, Mogherini, and Borrell. The only high representative that was missing was Ashton, who couldn't attend. And Solana said, in a very controversial statement, said this: back in the 2000s, we had less capacity as a European Union, but we had more influence. Today, he said, we have more capacity, we have more people, more resources, more agreements, but less influence. So what I think is interesting when talking about the EU and its quest for multilateralism is that, in contrast, or is the contrast between the 2000s and today. In the 2000s, it had great ambition to transform the neighborhood, to build alliances, to build an army, to cooperate with NATO, etc., 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 achieving integration, but it didn't have the capacity. Today, the EU, when you look at its foreign policy, is a bit less ambitious, even if it has integrated more than ever and has reached agreements between its member states. In his example, and this was before the controversy between Borrell and Lavrov, when Borrell went to Russia. In the webinar, Solana said that in 2008, he forced Russia to talk to Georgia in 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, according to Solana, he solved the crisis between Russia and Georgia. Today, the EU has been unable to stop, for instance, the conflict in Ukraine. And the other day, a couple of weeks ago, when Borrell went to Russia to speak with Lavrov and criticize the detention of Navalny, the leader of the opposition, Sergei Lavrov, said that, well, we all know that what he said. He criticized Borrell, Europe, and he dismissed Borrell. For many people, that was not only a critique to Borrell, but that was an humiliation to the EU. So the EU, in a sense, has lost its power to be decisive. My observation is not that Borrell is less capable than Solana, but that the world is more complicated for the EU. There is greater contestation. Russia is stronger today than it was 10 years ago. China is stronger, and therefore the EU needs to adapt to this complex and contested international relations, and it has no other choice than to build multilateral alliances and accept that it cannot be the great power or the transformatory power that once dreamt of. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it here, but maybe later I can also talk about other actors within the EU. But yeah, otherwise I will be talking too long.
Don't worry, I'll get back to you then. I'll take your word for it. Let me go to Maria Ángeles now, maybe to get more of an economic perspective on the future of the EU and its role in the multilateral arena, focused especially in economics. I don't know how you see it, if it can compete in the future, or maybe it's slowly waning as Paul was suggesting?
Well, certainly the EU is one of the big pillars of this globalized world. It shows, it presents a great experience, a successful experience to others. And when I was at the European Central Bank years ago, many years ago, we went to Asia and presented a conference because in Asia, they wanted to learn about how the European Union work and how they made it work. So it really played and plays a very significant role. But I still think that there is a lot that should be done and can be done. But perhaps from the US, from my angle, what I would also want to focus is on the concept of more inclusive and sustainable multilateralism, which I think the EU plays a big role in. And we see it with our work at the IMF. We usually do have 3 big work streams where we concentrate our efforts. One pillar is on program country. This is where we are mostly known. Unfortunately, when countries do have problems and come to us to ask for a program and some relief, some support, financial support, and that comes with the strings, comes with conditionality, and usually fixing problems, it requires tough choices, and often these choices are not very well accepted or publicly approved, because it requires sometimes shutting down institutions that are inefficient and that don't really justify with their performance. And we need to kind of envision something that is more sustainable for the situation of the country. Second work stream is surveillance. It's more about every year we do a health check, basically in each of the countries around the world, including the European countries. And there is one particular for the European Union. And there what we are trying is to identify these weaknesses and challenges that the countries have. The third one, where I think also European Union plays a major role, is on capacity building. It's perhaps is an area where it's less known, but the European Union is a big donor to help build capacity in other countries and support these efforts to strengthen institutions in other countries, in Africa or in say, the Central America or in the Caribbean, you name it. And it's basically an effort to help these economies to better integrate and benefit from multilateralism efforts, right? So I would say that from that angle, also European Union has a lot of value added to bring to the table, and they are doing it. And through the donor side, and by showing the experiences that and the challenges that they are confronted with. I mean, we don't only learn from the good experience, but also from the failures, right? We sometimes learn more from failure than from or difficulties and challenges than from successful stories. Perhaps just also to bring the role of institutions in this context, I also want to mention how important is building trust. In our work, it's not just about designing policies from top down, but it's about building up this trust that makes that recommendations and suggestions to the authorities are really trying to go to the core of the problems and understanding the context they are living in. It's very important for us to understand the political context and the risks associated the measures and the analysis that we are putting together. And for that, the role of other stakeholders, not just the central bank and Minister of Finance officials, which are typically our counterparts, but including civil society, worker associations, universities, everybody that has something that adds to the story that we typically hear from the authorities is extremely valuable to us, and it helps us to build a stronger multilateralism. Because after all, we are aimed to be objective and an impartial party in this situation, right? So I think that from our end, that's how we can help. We still have to honor always that the countries are have the legitimacy from the voters, right? At the end of the day, they have the responsibility vis-a-vis their population and the society that they are representing. But we can contribute, and we try to contribute by adding this objective and impartial view to it, and trying to strengthen cooperation from that side. Thank you.
No, thank you for your insight. Let me now go to Vassilis, and you've touched on the European Union a couple of times now during your different times speaking. So I don't know if you see what Paul was talking about, a EU that's less ambitious. I don't know if that's the same way you see it, or maybe less effective. I don't know what role you see for the EU in the future, and also if this, touching on what Paul was saying also about the role of subnational actors, if they can have a stronger role, especially in the EU that is so diverse. I'd love to hear your point of view on this.
Many thanks, Miquel. And of course, we need to be mindful that the EU that Solana was referring to in the 2000s was a much smaller EU in terms of member states, and whatever repercussions this has had on the internal aspect of multilateralism, the EU's own multilateral decision-making. But the EU, for all intents and purposes, is one of the greatest friends of the multilateral system. You can accuse the EU of inefficiency, of lack of influence. They're all valid criticisms, and I'd be the first one to underline them. But the EU has had the deepest, and in some respects, the longest experience in multilateralism, being a multilateral union in itself. Laura mentioned the multilateralism joint communique that was released by the Commission and the High Rep last week. There's a lot of good work that Maria Angels referred to when it comes to capacity building. There are good elements there. The EU is in the process of upgrading its own thinking about what it actually wants for and from the system. And I should also say that the EU has grown in terms of its own approach to multilateralism, because over time, referring to something somebody that Paul referred to, Javier Solana, he once said that the EU's relationship should be treated as less than a religion and more as a method. And I think this has also been a positive process of growing up for the EU's approach to multilateralism. But it's true that the EU itself cannot be everywhere and do everything. I mean, looking at some of these policy areas, the power differential between the EU as a multilateral structure and China, Russia, or the coherence that these actors can bring to the table, it implies that we can't really compare. But there are areas where I think the EU is uniquely located to act towards a better direction. And this I will connect to what you said about other actors. I think that the EU is uniquely located to become a more agile partner when it comes to positive multilateral change. And this I base it on the very simple fact that the EU has a deep, long experience and expertise in representing diverse interests and multiple stakeholders. But in order to do that, and the strategy, the joint communique that Laura referred to, does a good job at that, is to become itself much more agile in how it approaches partnerships. So I think it needs to move towards a model of partnering instead of partnerships. And a few facets of what could substantiate such a model. I think one, there is an increasing need for the EU and its pursuit of partnerships to become far less axiomatic. The Union will try and find allies, and will have to find allies around the world, but it is no longer sufficient to only work with like-minded states. So it will need to look at more atypical places to do this. And I think the big question for the EU in the coming years echoes something that my former colleague at Chatham House, Leslie Vinjamuri, recently wrote about. And she said that the next few years will be an experiment to see the countries like the US, and I would also add the EU, can succeed in cooperating with, for example, China on climate or Russia on arms control, while still calling out, being in a position to call out these countries on human rights violations, assaults on democratic norms, and so on and so forth. But I think there is value in the EU trying to expend more effort to trace overlapping interests with emerging powers like Brazil, like India, like China, and stand ready to form more complicated ad hoc coalitions of global change. And this is not to water down the EU's belief of adherence to values. It is rather to boost the EU's confidence that Paul mentioned, to promote these values in environments that are admittedly far more unstable, and via coalitions that by definition have to be more transient than in the past. And a second point, yes, let's work with atypical partners. A second point that the EU needs to do is, yes, let's work more creatively with sub-state or non-state actors. Take cyberspace, for example. We need to invest in these partnerships because not doing that will negate the very vitality of this domain. There is significant work that needs to be done there with civil society, with the private sector, with academia, and so on and so forth. And this is to foster, if you want, a climate of cross-pollination between the rigidly intergovernmental and all other layers. Same with climate. Climate governance is moving towards a more polycentric model of governance. So the Union's diplomacy cannot stop at the door of the COP, cannot be solely, and it is not solely constrained to the UNFCCC. But we need to spend more time to think about how we engage more with these actors. Because there is great importance to elevating partnerships with sub-state, with non-state actors, including stakeholders in local and regional government, civil society, and the private sector. Again, this does not detract in a way from an ongoing preference for formal multilateralism, but it does provide the undeniable potential of injecting multilateralism with fresh purpose, by way of identifying new grounds for consensus and cooperation. So agile partnering for the EU, less axiomatic treatment of other state actors, and stronger involvement, greater investment, and more agility in pursuing partnerships with non-state and sub-state actors.
Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes left, so if you don't mind, we're going to go directly to the questions that we've received on the YouTube chat, which you can still send us a couple if you have any. Actually, one thing we haven't talked about, and that it's come up in 2 questions so far, is talking about the Global South, which I think is very relevant because we sort of seem to, much like perhaps the power structure in many multilateral organizations, we seem to forget about them in many debates. So let me just read the 2 questions related, and maybe I'll start with Paul. First, we have a question from Eduardo Turren, which says, is the Global South taking a fair share of responsibilities and power in these global institutions? What should be their role? And also Marta asks, If there's no likelihood of reform within UN in the medium term, what are the prospects of the UN's role in a context where non-state actors are energetically rising and Global South asks for representativity and new challenges appear, which differ in UN initial goals? Could it become outdated? So let's talk about the role of the Global South in these multilateral arenas, which, as you mentioned, they're very diverse. So I don't know, Paul, if you want to focus on the Global South, and they're asking for more responsibilities. Are they taking also their fair share of responsibilities, and what should be their role? I'm giving you the hard question to start off.
Yes, thank you. Oh, thank you to the audience for the questions. Much appreciated. Yes, that's a very difficult question. Of course, or the South. I would say that the South is already speaking, and the South is acting. The African Union is doing, for instance, a great job in dealing with the pandemic. Is cooperating the South. So the South is no longer about developing African countries from our point of view, or about what can we do to help them or to represent them. The South is already acting. So, and I would say that when thinking about multilateralism, what we need to see is that perhaps multilateralism is about decentering Europe and the US as the core of these multilateral initiatives. For instance, the Belt and Road Initiative starts in China and ends in Duisburg in West Germany for now, but it will continue until all places in Europe. So it starts from Asia and ends up here, which is of course the opposite of how we used to think of partnerships. But also the EU and Africa and African Union partnership, it was traditionally very, very hierarchical. It was a vertical relation between the EU and the African Union. What could the EU do to help the African Union to develop the economy of African countries? But now it is no longer the case. There is a more equal partnership. There is an horizontal dialogue, and efforts are made from the South that this is actually the case. So when we speak about the South in the context of multilateralism, I think it's already happening. The decentering of a Western idea of multilateralism and international relations. This would be my answer.
Marianjas, I don't know if you agree. You work in it. So do you see this decentering in your institution specifically, or in other multilateral arenas towards the Global South?
Well, what I see is that the South is facing a lot of challenges. I see the South confronted with a lot of progress and a lot of ownership on reforms, but also a lot of setbacks and periods where that progress gets stalled and we have to rebuild. So it's a mixed picture. What I would say, we are providing enormous amount of technical assistance in all areas in Africa, and we're trying to basically make sure that the capacities are there, and that's usually the challenge, because when there is a lot of incentives of mobility, and when there is know-how, then it moves to advanced economies because of migration and salaries and conditions. So it's always these different adverse incentives around that work against the bottom-up development of the South. However, I think they're a partner on the table. They sit on all the governing boards at the IMF or at the World Bank, and we do have a lot of initiatives and partnerships with them. And I think that, yes, they do have to act. That's their obligation, but they also have to receive, right? It's a partnership. And I would share the same approach with emerging market economies, where they also have to bring their share, and not only with the international community as such, but also vis-a-vis the South, because they've gone through these stages of development, and they can contribute enormously. And sometimes we don't see that relationship that is that transparent and on equal terms either. So I think there is a lot that everybody can do, but I think there is a lot that is being done, and they are very vocal. So I'm looking forward to them to exercise that power of the current environment, and open borders in a way to get their way and their voices heard.
Thank you, Marianne. Just let me move the question now to Vassilis. And also let me add a second question, which is directed to you from Joan Chicona from Terrassa City Council International Department, who says, I think you've touched on this, but I think if you can elaborate a bit more. Do you think political rigidity is preventing crucial reforms? I think he asked this question during your first intervention on also the United Nations specifically, I believe.
Yeah, many thanks. Just on that, yes, rigidity sometimes is the reason behind a state of paralysis or an almost imperceptible pace of evolution. Sometimes it's inadequate funding, sometimes it's institutional inertia, sometimes it's lack of political will. But the aggregate of all these factors, and as I said, sometimes it's the lack of willingness to engage in this mindset shift. But the aggregate is a system where often things, processes, bureaucracies are left to deal with the aftermath rather than the root cause of events. An added layer there is that of politicization. If the system does not function and great power competition really becomes the norm of the day, even in mundane institutional matters, we're running the risk that even a simple decision about, and we've seen this in the recent past, about the extension of a mandate of a UN peacekeeping expedition or force, it will become politicized, So every small thing, every small chain link in the longer chain of how an organization like the UN might get even more paralyzed, not just at the Security Council, but elsewhere as well. So I think it's much more varied than that, but indeed, political rigidity, rigidity of thinking is a great part of why we've come to this. A quick point on the Global South, I would very much agree with Paul. I think the South is speaking, is acting, and has spoken and acted for a long time now. BRICS is the usual example that is offered here, but this is a reality that we've been experiencing for a long time now. But I guess the responsibility for entities like the EU is not to stifle this discussion, this speak. It's to allow this conversation to come to the forefront. Paul mentioned the African Union, for example. Going beyond the platitudes on the particular tangible matters, what is the EU's position? Yes, it's generally in favor of open trade, but what is the EU's position towards the African continental free trade area, if this means losing a few privileges when it comes to trade itself? What is its own position towards migration, where essentially in the previous years we saw a securitization of the EU's approach towards migration vis-a-vis Africa? And I guess a larger question that the EU needs to confront is whether the EU views multilateralism as something inherently good, as an antidote to great power politics, as a way of coming to collective decisions, or whether it views multilateralism as a system, as a form of power in itself, and which by virtue of its own vested interests, by virtue of its own privileged position, it is willing to use it to get to results that it itself wants. So I think these are critical things that the EU needs to face up to. because the Global South rightfully demands its stronger voice to be more coherently heard. It requires a greater place around the table, and the EU needs to face up to these realities and decide what it wants to do in order not to drink water, to drink wine internally while preaching water externally.
That's a good reference. Let me, as we have 5 minutes, let me just make one last question that we have here. I think I'm going to taking from this last comment that you said, Vassilis, is that they have to decide, how they want to move forward. We have a question from Isidra who says, it's easy to, first there's a comment, it's easy to criticize the multilateral system, but unilateralism can never be an alternative to overcome global challenges. And his question is, are we doomed that whenever a strong leader or an unexpected global challenge like COVID emerges, the major powers will be always tempted to promote their own unilateral agenda? I think this is something, as you were saying, the EU is still deciding how it wants to use this multilateralism. Paul, I don't know if we're doomed to this kind of future, or perhaps you want to be more of an optimist that we can find a way to make multilateral systems work for the benefit of all.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think everybody would agree with Isidra that there is no alternative to multilateralism, or that multilateralism is better than unilateralism to solve world's problems. But the key is how to articulate multilateralism, how to implement it, or how to make it how to make it work. If I may, I was looking at DIPLOCAT's website, and I saw that the perfect description of what is multilateralism as we think it today, which is conectamos, proyectamos, capacitamos, connecting, projecting, capacitating, and it says international dialogue. This is, I think, the idea of or the dream, the ideal, the aspiration of multilateralism, which is connecting, is relating, is projecting ideas, and even capacitating us, is the creation of a global dialogue, of an horizontal partnership between civil society and non-state actors. The problem, I think, and this has been suggested by Marie-Angels and Vassilis several times. I think the problem is the more you open up to civil society, non-state actors, the more you include others, and this is always positive, of course, the more difficult it is to reach agreements. So difference leads us to sort of competition. You want difference to reach a consensus, but the more you open up, the more difficult it is, and that's the struggle. And I think it won't be overcome easily, of course. But that's international relations. Is the space to interact between different actors, plural actors, and that's it. It won't be solved. It won't be solved in the near future for sure, because that's the essence of international relations.
Marie-Angels, let me throw this question to you. Can we strengthen this global dialogue enough so that it's not at the mercy of one or two very loud actors?
I do think yes, and we should, for the good of everybody. I think that we do know that multilateralism, even if it's not totally perfect yet, and it will never be, because there's always progress and improvements to be made. Unilateralism, we know for certain that is a lose-lose solution. So there is no other option, basically, for an inclusive and a growth, prosperous outlook for everybody, basically. And more in this integrated world, we depend on each other. That's one point. But the other point is that we don't live in a static world. We are in a dynamic situation, right? Outlook. And I would think, for instance, 50 years ago, nobody would think about India or Brazil or China being questioning powers like the EU or the European Union or the US, right? And in many areas, they do play a big role in the decision making. And we are talking now about China competing with the US, who is going to be leading. That wasn't the debate 50 years ago. So yes, there is a lot of homework to be done. But there is also what we know in economics called leapfrogging, and economies and the balances changing. But what we aim for is for a more balanced and inclusive international world in which we promote growth and standards of living to a point in which it benefits as many as possible. That's really the ultimate goal, and the best solution we have as of now is multilateralism and listening all the voices, because they all add value. And it's the point of diversity that I was trying to make earlier. It's not about harmonizing and one rule applies to everybody. It's about diverse views that bring the color to the unified view, right? That's what I would say.
Thank you. Let me just throw it back to Vassilis for his last comment on this. I don't know if you've posed a question on the EU. I don't know what path do you think they're going to take and how that will affect the future of multilateralism around the world.
Okay, I've offered many pessimistic notes throughout my intervention, so I'm going to try and end on a more positive note. I think there are positive developments. Pol said that we might not expect dramatic differentiation between Trump and Biden in certain key areas, but it is a positive development, what happened. It might not amount, again, to fundamental change, but these are small positive changes that can lead to something, could lead to something positive overall. And just perhaps not about the EU, because I did say that the EU is one of, if not the greatest friend of the multilateral system, and I think that's still valid. I think we have, surprisingly or perhaps counterintuitively, a few things going in our favor. One is the very fact that, as I said, COVID was not the crisis that defined our times in such dramatic ways as World War II, but it was a profound crisis. It showed to many how close we came to the precipice. So this is an alarming evidence of that change must come sooner rather than later. Secondly, I think we have the power of hindsight that we didn't have in 1930s, 1940s, the interwar period. We know of the collapse of the League of Nations. This is something very important. Also, looking at the history of the UN, we can see that it was always plagued by paralytical syndromes. The Cold War period had many instances where many people were saying that the system, the Security Council, and so on and so forth, was effectively paralyzed because of the competition between the Soviet Union and the US. It's just that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a sense of euphoria. There was a sense of expansion of the system, a multilateralism 2.0, if you want, reaching much further in the past in areas like responsibility to protect. So we're comparing the current status of the multilateral system against that very high point. But crisis was always embedded in the history of the system. So we have the power of hindsight. But I should say, and this should allow us to assess much better than in the past the probability of a multilateral collapse. And of course, we need a crystal ball to see whether this moment, 2021, after the COVID experience, will ultimately spell the end of the multilateral paradigm or signal the beginning of a restorative process. But I want to end on this. It's very crucial that we stop pretending that nothing is wrong, because this was the recipe that doomed the League of Nations, that led to previous crises. Averting the system collapse should become a priority. And I should refer to the mythological past of my home country, Greece. Cassandra was a very well-known Greek mythological figure, and she would agree that being right in predicting the future at times of peril is not enough. Action is necessary. So in that sense, I hope that action, tangible action, real action, real change is the norm of the day going forward. Just to end on that positive note.
Thank you very much. I think today we've shed some light on some issues. As Vassilis said at the beginning, multilateralism has many faces and it's a multi-dynamic. And so maybe we'll come back for the next 50 weeks and do 50 of these talks to talk about more specific issues. But for now, let's just hope that we can build on this trust. I think it's a word that we said a lot today. Compromises, I think it's also another word we said today. So thank you, Pol Bargués, Maria Àngels Oliva, Vassilis, Ntousas, and to finish off, I'll hand it over to Laura Foraster for the final words. Thank you very much for participating.
Moltes gràcies, Miquel. Thank you very much to the panelists and to you, Miquel, to the moderator, for this very rich and fruitful debate. Haristo Poli to Vassilis. And thank you as well to all attendees for following it and for all your comments and insights. We have gone through many issues with a mix of positive and negative points of view and opinions. We even had a mythologic reference right now, so it was very broad and diverse. But the main conclusions I personally draw from the discussion are that first, we do need a strong multilateral system, but its reform is a must to make it more flexible in order to adapt to itself, to the economic, social, and of course, political changes and challenges as well. And second, in this reform, there is a role not only for the EU, of course, it was clear, but also for sub-state and non-state actors. And I believe that only by doing so, we could make the multilateral system effective, legitimate, and sustainable, and achieve this global and international dialogue that has been mentioned as well, that we pursue. So it's a big challenge for sure, but we can work on that. And just nothing else to add from my side. Just remember that, as usually, the video of the whole debate will be available in the DIPLOCAT YouTube channel with the same link. And also a briefing will be published in the coming weeks. And finally, please note that our next DIPLOCAT digital talk will be next Tuesday, the 2nd of March, and it will be about technological platforms and fake news. You're all invited to join it and to stay tuned by following our Twitter profile, Catalonia PD, or our profile in LinkedIn, and see you soon. Take care. Thank you.